everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be sharing with you 6 different ways to add snow effects to your cards. These are all different. They're all really fun and easy. It's a long video, but I promise stick with it till the end. They're all fun ways and easy ways with supplies you probably already have or might already have on hand. So here's a look at some of the stamps I'll be using on the first card. Now, everything I'm using will all be listed and linked down in the description box below because there are a lot of products going on in this video here. So the first thing I did was die cut an oval from the waffle flower oval nesting set. And I die cut that from a piece of craft cardstock that I'll be using as my main panel. Now, with that oval and one slightly larger, I'm going to put those together and run those through with some gold cardstock to create a frame that's going to outline that oval that I die cut into the first craft panel. That first craft panel was slightly smaller than A2, so it was 4 inches by 5 1/4. And that panel, once it had the oval die cut, I'm going to add some dry embossing to this with the wood grain embossing folder. Just a little something extra to do with it to add a little more interest to this card. If you wanted to, ink blending is another great option, or just use pattern paper to start with, which is always super easy to do. Then you don't have to take that extra embossing step. To outline the area I need to work within on my card base, I'm going to place that oval panel, that craft oval panel, right on top of the card base, which is A2 in size, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'll just use a pencil to go ahead and outline that oval. Use a really light hand when you do this because it will need to be erased later on. Now, once that is done, it's time for our first way to add snow effects, and that is just by simply having white space on your card. So I went ahead and masked off the area outside the oval, so I have some nice white edges on my card base here. And then with another piece of painter's tape and my craft knife, I'm going to go ahead and cut a hilly border. Now, if you wanted to, you could use a die if you had one on hand, which I do. However, I find it easiest just to grab my craft knife and create one myself. It's going to be different every time, and it's a lot of fun to do. Now, if you're doing some certain techniques, you might want to use your die just so it's the same every time you cut it. However, with this kind of card and this kind of technique, just doing it with your craft knife is perfectly fine. I place that down, and then it's time to do some ink blending. So the whole point of having white space for your snow, you need to have some color around it wherever the snow isn't going to be. In this case, it's going to be the sky on this scene. So the bottom portion of this, I'm going to be completely white. And then around the top, I want to add some blue for the sky. Now, I don't want this to be overpowering blue, and the lightest way for ink blending for me is to use my clarity brushes. So that's what I'm using here with something borrowed ink from Catherine Pooler. Now I'm starting at the base closest to where those hills are, and then I'm working my way up towards the top. And as I'm going up, I'm going lighter. So darkest towards those hills, lighter towards the top. I do want to mention also at this point, you need to go ahead and erase your lines. Once they're under that ink, they're not coming up. Once I have the ink blending how I want it, I can go ahead and remove that bottom portion of painter's tape, and there I've got that nice snowy hill ready to go on my card, and all it took was a little bit of ink blending and some white space. Now, to give it just a little bit more definition, I like to take a gray colored pencil. You could just use a regular pencil too because, you know, lead's gray itself. But just very, very, very lightly go up against where the blue and the white meet and just create a thin, faint line that is going to give a little bit of definition to where the sky ends and the hilly border begins, and it just adds a little bit more of that definition to the background itself. It's a little bit of a shadow, if you will. Now, you could do this with some ink blending, maybe go in a little bit lower and add some more painter's tape and go in and do a little bit of gray ink blending. But I find just a little bit of the colored pencil does a wonderful job of adding that shadow effect. Now I'll go ahead and erase the bottom portion of that oval, and it's time to finish off this scene. And at this point, I no longer need those edges on my card base, so I can go ahead and peel those off. Now, whenever you're peeling up the painter's tape, because I do use a lot of it when masking, I like to first, before I even put it down, stick it to my shirt a few times. That is going to take away a little bit of that stick Also, whenever you're using it, don't press too hard on it unless you really need it to stick, like if you're doing some watercolor. But most of the time, you don't need to press it down super hard. Another thing, whenever you're pulling it up, pull it straight back on itself, and that should work perfectly to get it up. If you see it kind of ripping at any point, just stop and go back and start on the other end. Now for the rest of the scene, I'm going to do some stamping. These stamps are from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. All the stamps I'm using today are. And I want to stamp these little deer. They're little silhouettes. And I think it's a great little addition to this scene. Now I'm stamping these specifically on the right-hand side of this oval to make sure I get them positioned within the oval that I'm using for my little frame of my scene. I need to make sure that oval's in place. So I like to stick it in my MISTI, use my magnet to hold it down, and then I can stamp those deer down. I used VersaFine Clair and Fallen Leaves, which is a nice brown ink. Now underneath each one of those deers, there is going to be a little shadow naturally. So again, I'm bringing back in that gray pencil and adding in a little bit of shadow. If you wanted to, you could always go in with some ink blending. There are even some stamps on the market that are specifically designed to add shadows to stamped images. So those are great stamp sets to have on hand as well. Or just use a half circle and then kind of blend it out with your finger towards the bottom of the circle so it's not such a harsh line. So there is a closer look at those little deer with their shadow underneath them all ready to go. And of course that white space is just perfect to add the perfect snowy background to this card. Now I wanted it to look like there was some branches in front of where the focal point was. So I'm using this pine branch stamp. I've used it tons of times from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. And the first thing I want to do is go ahead and stamp it down with different colors. So I want this to be more realistic looking. Instead of just stamping it all in green or something like that, I am going to do some selective inking. Now on a piece or a stamp that is this detailed, I like to pull out my markers, my memento markers. These are so great for stamping detailed images in different colors. For this one, I grabbed 3 different colors. I'm using the brown where I guess the stems of the branch would be, not the stems. I'm having a brain fart, whatever they're called in there, the limbs. And I'll go ahead and color those in with the brown marker and stamp those down. Again, I'm using my MISTI here because with stamping with your markers, I find twice is best just to get the darkness and the depth of color I want. Now I clean my stamp really well, and then it's time to go in with the green wherever the pine needles are. Now because we stamped with brown first, I don't really need to be super careful with this green. If it would be a lighter color than what I'm going in with second, you need to be careful of where you place the first color. But this green isn't really going to change the color of the brown because it's so dark. So I'm just scribbling this on, and then I can go ahead and stamp it down. Again, I stamped once, and again, inking it up very quickly just by scribbling down the color on the stamp, and I'll stamp it down again just for that really nice solid color I'm looking for. So if you have a stamp positioner and you're doing marker stamping, use it. It's going to help you in the long run. Once I had that stamped down the second time with the light green ink, it is time to go ahead and add a little bit more depth with the darker green. Now with this, I'm not going everywhere. I'm just going to go on the very tips of these needles. And with this one, I really did only do it once because it was just the tips of these that I wanted to add a little depth. It's nothing that I need super solid. So I stamped that down, and then it's ready to go for our second way to add snow, which is with heat embossing, specifically a white based embossing powder. If you want to add a little glitter, go for it. I did on my second card, which I'll show you later on. Now for this, because I have some VersaFine Clairing down at the bottom, I have some Catherine Pooler ink blending going on, and I just did my marker stamping. I am really giving this a good dusting with my embossing bag, so no powder gets where it's not supposed to. Now the majority of the time when I'm doing embossing, I use my Versamark ink pad, but that would be a little cumbersome in what I'm trying to do today. I want to get specifically just on the tips of those pine needles with my Versamark ink. Now you could turn your Versamark ink pad and just stamp it at an angle, being super careful, but I never have good luck with that. So this Versamarker that I have on hand here is the same thing as a Versamark pad, just in a marker form. And it comes in so handy for things like this, certain techniques, but also whenever I screw up with my embossing. So if I'm doing a lined embossing and I miss just a little portion of stamping with the line, all I have to do is go in with this Versamark marker, add a little bit, and then it holds the embossing powder perfectly. It saves me a lot of time and a lot of trouble and really a lot of product because I'm not throwing away so many of my mistakes. Now for this, I'm just taking the marker and going on the edges, those very tips of the needles, specifically on the top of the branch. I'm not doing so much on the bottom because really when snow falls, it doesn't stick to the bottom of branches very well. Just to the very tips normally. I live in Iowa, so I get to see a lot of snow. But once I had that on there, I can go ahead and stamp that down right over the top. And because I'm using my Misty, I know it's going to line up perfectly. Now for my embossing powder, I'm using the Imagine embossing powder, and this is just in the color white. If you wanted to, you could add some glitter to it. Just for this, I'm using a fine detail because that's what I need in this specific occasion. So I went ahead and put that on, and because I used so much in my embossing powder, it only stuck to where it was supposed to. If you have any stray powders, use a paintbrush. Then it was time to go ahead and heat set. Now, I knew better than to heat set on my card base. I always have warping, and I know better, but I did it anyway, and so I was stuck with a warpy card base. Sometimes you can get it to bend back. I was unsuccessful with this, so here's a little tip. If you go in and you do some embossing, you warp your card base, cut off the front of it. Super simple and easy to do. Save that back piece for another card. You're not wasting anything. And just glue it to another card base. That way, it's going to go ahead and flatten that out a little bit. And then you don't have to worry about the wonkiness of the card itself. So that glue, I'm using a liquid here. You could also use a dry adhesive. Just make sure that whenever you use a dry adhesive, you don't end up with a big bump in the middle of it. So do one side first and then kind of press it down. But once I have that glued on, I am ready to go and add my frame now. I added the frame and also the frame around the frame, the gold piece, and then I needed to add my sentiment. Now another little tip here, I had my sentiment ready to go and I knew I wanted to add it to a flag banner, but it was a little bit long. So I die cut the flag banner and then I put it right back in the die, but slightly shifted it down so the edge of the die cut is hanging out of the die. I'll run that back through my die cutting machine, and this is going to cut off that edge but make it a nice flag banner on the other side as well. So then I end up with this perfect fishtail banner that I didn't have to hand cut, so I know it's nice and straight and even, but it fits my sentiment a little bit better and I don't have as much white space on the end of that. So there's a look at the final card after everything was put together. And now let's move on to the second card. So for the second card, I'm using these two stamps from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. Again, every stamp, all the products will be listed in the description box below. Now for this stamp, I am going to use the same technique I did on the first card. So I'll just show you one tree. I am using my Misty again for this because I'll be doing some marker stamping. I am working on a piece of cardstock slightly smaller than an A2 size. Really doesn't matter at this point because I'll be cutting it down later on anyway. For this tree, I am doing some more of that marker stamping using my Memento markers. Because of that, using my Misty, and I went ahead and lined up the tree on the card panel, then picked it up with the lid of my Misty. Now with my Misty, I am using rubber stamps today that are cling mounted. So I do have that mouse pad out of the bottom of the Misty, and I'm just working straight in the Misty. I started off with some brown ink just on the base of the tree. Then I'm coming in with this darker green. Or this is my mid-tone green, I guess I should say. And I'm just putting it around those branches. With this, again, the brown is darker, so I really don't have to worry about overlapping so much. It's not going to create that big of a deal because the green is lighter. It's not going to change the color of the brown. So I'll scribble that again, stamped it once, then scribble it again and stamp it down again. Now for my third and final color, I'm going in with a much darker green, and I'll just put that right on the edges, kind of flicking it from the edge towards the center. Now with this, I still felt the lines were a little bit harsh, so what I decided to do was once I got done with the marker, I took my finger and just kind of smushed them a little bit to even them out and not create such harsh lines. I did create a mask before I stamped, so each one of these trees I'll go ahead and mask, or just this one really. I masked off and then I stamped off to the right another tree and then also off to the left. So in total I stamped 3 separate trees on this panel. I'm not going to show you each one because it's just more of the same of what I did before. But whenever you are doing masking, once you have your first image and you want to put something behind it like I'm doing here, you need to make sure that it is slightly higher than what you previously stamped. So here you can see I placed my tree and it was a little bit lower. It looks fine now when it's in the stamp form, but once you get this stamped, it's going to look a little funky, a little off. It's never going to look quite right. So make sure anything that you're stamping behind another image is slightly higher than what you previously stamped. So I stamped each one of those little images just like I did before, and now it's time to add some more snow effects. Now my next way to add snow is with puff paint and markers. I'm going to show you 2 different ways. The first way I want to show you is with the Marby snow marker. But later on in the video, I'm also going to be using that Amplify from Imagine. Now, both of these are great products. Just with playing with them on these cards, I really prefer the Imagine Amplify. The Marby Snow Marker is not as white, and it's a little bit more messy, a little bit more runny. I feel like I have more control with the Amplify bottle. I can also paint it on if I wanted to with the paintbrush because it is a paint. And also, but again, with the Imagine, it takes a little bit longer to dry, and you also need to make sure, because it is a paint, that the underneath is dry, which I'll show you later on in the video. Now with the marker, all you do is take the tip of that marker and run it along your paper. If you ever feel like you need a little bit more of the liquid inside of it, just press the tip of the marker down and you can scribble it on out. Really simple and easy to use. So I added it all along the base of the trees. And then I'm also going to add it to little pieces of the tree as well, or little branches, I guess I should say. Now, whenever you are adding this over markers or things that are water soluble, so inks, things like that, you need to be super careful and just tap it. Don't pull it, don't kind of use it like you would a normal marker. Just tap it down. If you go over this too much and you end up running the marker across it, it's going to drag your ink, it's going to ruin your image, and it might ruin your marker too. So just be super careful when you're doing something like this and going over water soluble areas. Because this is a liquid, it's going to move those inks. So again, just be super careful. You don't want to add too much either. So I added little bits to each one of those trees. The stamp was kind of made for this because it has some white spots where the snow is supposed to be. So I just went over those white spots. So it was super simple to know where it was supposed to go. Now once I had this marker down, it's time to heat set. Now you're first going to start heat setting this and think, this isn't working. You know, it's taking too long. It's not drying. Keep going. I promise it will start to work. And again, sorry for this video. It's super hard to see because of the light on this and it's white on white. But once you get going, it is really going to start puffing up. So I was heat setting for about a full minute before anything started to happen, just to let you know. And the thicker you put this on, the longer it's going to take to puff up. So don't give up, just keep going. I promise it will work. But you can see as it starts to puff, it really gets some fun dimension in there. You get those puffed up pieces, and it's just a lot of fun. Now once it starts to puff, you want to be careful. You can get a little bit more puffing out of it, but if you go too much on this stuff, it will burn. I have burnt it before. I've had some brown spots. Then you're just kind of left with trying to sand that off if you can. Other than that, you might need to start over. So once you have it all puffed up, I found that the top of it with the trees, it was just a little bit too transparent for me. So what I decided to do was come in with a white gel pen just right over the top of that to really give it some opacity and darken it up and help it stand out a little bit more as well. This didn't do anything to the puffing part of it, it just added a little bit more opacity. There you can see a little bit of the puffing down at the bottom. I did cover most of it up with my next way, which is heat embossing powder with laminating. I seen this on, I believe, Jennifer McGuire's channel, and I wanted to give it a try myself to see if I could get it to work. So I had some embossing sheets lying around, or not embossing, laminating sheets lying around from a project I did for my daughter to practice her numbers and letters and whatnot. So I had some extra ones in my craft room. I grabbed one of those out. These are from Amazon. They're the 3mm kind, 3mm kind, and they're Amazon brand. In that sheet, laminating sheet, I'm adding some embossing powder. I used a mixture of white embossing powder and also the Imagine's iridescent opaque embossing powder I also used, and that just has a little bit of glitter mixed in with the white embossing powder, which is super fun. So I put that in the laminating sheet and ran it through my laminator. It got a little stuck in the beginning. You can see I just pulled it out and let it keep going. There's no need in throwing it away. Just because I can't use the top, I can cut that off and just use the bottom of this. Now I found with this, running it through once is all you need. If you run it through any more than that, it starts to get weird on you. It starts to look a little watery almost, like it has some condensation around it. So run it through once, and then you've got this gorgeous snowfall background. It worked really well other than getting stuck on me, but that's my machine's fault. That's not the technique's fault. So anyway, this cuts down super easily too. It didn't fall apart on me. It didn't start coming apart at the seams or anything. Even though I cut this down right in the center, still worked beautifully. Now I added this to a frame. All I did on the frame was die cut it. I used one of my favorites, Cat Scrappiness Wood Grain Frame Die. I put a little bit of dry adhesive on the back, which I think works best for slick surfaces like this. And then I just stuck it down right on the back of that frame. This would make a great shaker card. But I just ended up attaching it right over the top of those trees with a little bit of foam adhesive. That foam tape is just going to pop away the acetate, or in this case the laminating sheet, and just give it a little bit of space between the snowfall and trees for a little bit more depth. Now I did go ahead and place this down, trim the top of that panel on the background off. This is a great way to add snowfall. It is a gorgeous technique, and you should really give it a try if you have the supplies on hand. If not, I'll leave everything I used listed down in the description box below. To finish this card, I added a banner sentiment, thinking of you, that was from Cracker Box and Susie Stamped. I used Versifying Claire in Fallen Leaves for that. Now on to the third card. So this one's probably my favorite. I just love the little stamps that I used on this one. I'm using that truck from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps along with the tree to go in the bed of it, but there are so many other images that go in this truck that fit inside of it. It's super cute. I'll leave some of those linked down below too. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole coloring of the tree and the truck itself. I did it with colored pencils in OMS. So I stamped them with some Memento Tuxedo Black ink using my Misty. I will throw the coloring up over on Instagram today, so you can go check that out over there if you're interested. But this video is already long enough without adding in all of that coloring too. So it was super simple coloring. I'm not great at it. I do what I can, add a little bit of shading, but it's over there if you want to see it. So anyway, I stamped those out, colored them in, and fussy cut them as well. Then it was time to do some die cutting. Now for this, I'm going to be placing everything onto an oval die cut. So I'm using that same waffle flower set and die cutting an oval from some white cardstock. Now with that same oval, I'm also going to cut a piece of adhesive. This is just an adhesive sheet. You can get it from scrapbook.com. This is also ScorePal. ScorePal's a little bit thicker. Scrapbook.com is stickier. It's just whatever your preference is. So I just needed the bottom of that, so I cut maybe a quarter of the oval. Now, before I put on that adhesive sheet, I'm actually going to do a little bit of ink blending just to separate the sky from the snow portion of this scene. Again, I want this super light, so I'm using my clarity brushes here, and I'm using some It's a Boy ink from Catherine Pooler. that I used before with the Something Borrowed. Now I'm just checking to make sure that's dark enough and I like the way it looks, so then it's time to go ahead and add that adhesive sheet right there on the bottom of the oval. Because I use the same die cut, it's going to fit together perfectly. I just like to line up one side and then remove the rest of the backing paper and give it a firm press with my fingers to make sure everything's nice and secure on there. Then I can release that front paper and it's time to add our third snow effect, or our next snow effect, which is craft snow. Now, I got mine from Target last year in the dollar spot. It's close to Christmas, so they might be coming out with some more of this. I don't know. But if not, I'll leave a link to some on Amazon. You can also find this at your local craft store, and it's super cheap. But I like the little bag of this because I don't put this around my house. I just use this in my crafting. So this little bag is perfect for me. It's still going to last a long time. With this craft snow, it's super simple. You put down some adhesive. I like the adhesive sheets because it sticks right away, it's super sticky, and it's not going to go anywhere. Now, once I put that down, I just sprinkle the snow on top and give it firm presses with my finger to make sure everything's nice and embedded. Now, this is not going to be really like stuck on there where none is going to shut off. You might have a few pieces that fall off here and there, but the majority of it is going to stick on there. Now I like to give this a few taps on the back once I feel like everything's on there, just to make sure I get the majority of the pieces that are going to fall off. So firm taps on the back and then it's ready to go. I love this effect and it's so easy to do. It doesn't take any time at all either, which is great. Now I also wanted to show you the Imagine pen, the Amplify that I showed you earlier along with the Marvy Snow Marker. This I like better, but the Marvy Snow Marker I've had for longer. The Imagine is a little bit tricky to work with though, just because you want to make sure that you heat it not only from the front, from the back too. Because it is a paint, it's thicker, so it takes a little bit longer to dry. And if you don't dry it underneath, if you bump it at all, it will smear because the underneath won't be quite dry. So make sure you're hitting it with your heat gun from the front and the back. But with this, I like it because I've got that really fine applicator, first of all. This is more white than the Marvy, I feel like it is anyway. And also, if I feel like the applicator is maybe too much, then I can go in, squeeze a little bit out on some paper, and use a paintbrush to put it down. It's super versatile in that form, whereas the Marvy, you just kind of have the marker to put it down. You don't have other options, really. And again, this one's just a little bit more white, which I love, and it puffs up more. I mean, it really puffs. You get some nice dimension with this. So, like I said before, same with Marvy. Let your heat gun heat up. I let mine heat up for like a full minute before I brought it. You want it nice and hot. Then you want to heat it from the front and the back. This especially is going to feel like it's never going to puff up because it is a thicker product. But once this stuff gets going, you're going to be like, holy cow, that's enough puffing. I mean, it really wants to puff up and give a lot of dimension. This stuff's really neat. I like to give it a once over with my heat gun, let it sit for a little bit and cool off because again, this stuff can burn, but then come back and give it another heating just to make sure everything's nice and dry, and look at that dimension. It's so fun. Now, that tree I went ahead and glued into the back of the truck. Then I added some foam tape onto the back of each one of those, and I'll pop that right on that oval that I have the snow and the ink blending on to create this fun little scene. Now there's a closer look at that all ready to go. For the tree, I did add a few little Nouveau embellishments on top of it, but I want to get to my last way of adding snow effects, which is with your paste. This is super easy to do. I'm putting mine through a stencil today, and I am using my light and fluffy embossing paste, modeling paste, excuse me, from the Crafters Workshop. However, there are a lot of different brands that have this. You probably already have one. I've used the whip spackle. I've used the embossing paste from Ranger. It's kind of all the same thing. This is just the one I like best, and I am on their design team, so that is what I use. Now for this, I'm going to go ahead and spread this through my stencil. This is another from Crafters Workshop. This is actually a cake and cookie stencil. So if you're into baking and decorating, these are a great option. They're food safe. However, I don't bake, so I am just going to go ahead and use these in my craft room. I am putting this through my stencil, the light and fluffy modeling paste, right through my stencil onto my card base itself. I am doing a pretty thick layer. You can go as thick or as thin as you like. Another great technique with this is to just put it on by itself and then heat set it. And this puffs up too. It is so cool. You do want to be careful that you don't burn it, but it's another great way to add a snow effect also. So if you don't have a snow stencil and you just have this, use what you have. Put it on with a palette knife or an old credit card or gift card, and then puff it up with your heat tool. It's a super fun look too. Now for this, once I put it on with a stencil, I like to go ahead and run my finger along the edges just to get rid of any little overhang or sharp edges. Let it dry, and then I can add my oval on top. I added a believe sentiment as well. I did add glossy accents to the window with this one too, but that is it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and a look at all the different ways you can add snow to your cards. So many different ways. I'm sure you have a few of your own, and if you want to share those, leave those down in the description box below. I'd love to hear about them. Thanks for watching, everyone, and happy crafting.